Even when I was younger, I was always fascinated with the differences in box art region to region. I really didn't know there was such a thing until I started importing Mega Drive games in 1990, and found out just how different Japanese game boxes could look beside their American counterparts. While a few games were similar, most of the time it was radically different in style and detail, making me actually want one over the other just for that. Believe it or not, it wasn't always better in Japan, particularly once you introduce some of the fine art from European variants, which could be quite impressive themselves. In this episode, we are going to look at some box art across a couple of generations of Sega machines, and look at some of my favorite games throughout the years, and why I chose the versions I did. I hope you guys enjoy my favorite Sega box art. Since Strider is one of the very first games I ever imported, let's start there. Many of us are familiar with the Flash Gordon-esque art that was plastered across the US, Brazil, and European releases of the game, with even the Master System version sporting the same design. The Japanese version took a very different route, relying on a much more anime style and cartoonish characterization. It put emphasis not just on Strider, but also his enemies, and the back of the cover was colorful and showed off one of the set pieces within the game. The Korean release followed the Japanese style, and I must admit, I greatly prefer this to the US original. One reason being is that the art continues onto the back of the cover, yet doesn't sacrifice the screenshots. This would actually be a trait I adored about Japanese covers for years to come. The next title I chose because it's one of the first titles I ever imported based solely on its art. Golden Axe had been out in the US and Japan for quite a while when I decided to import it, and here's why. The US cover art is classic in its own right. It has the three main playable heroes across the classic Sega grid. I loved it, but after seeing the Japanese version, I had to have that one as well. Just look at it. Not only does it get that gorgeous take on the heroes, but it continues onto the back of the cover, showing its fantasy world in a shadow of Death Adder himself. They even managed to preserve a few screenshots, even with all that great art. I later found out that the European release follows the Japanese design and looked pretty nifty itself. Altered Beast is an interesting one because it's one of the rare examples of every region using the same basic design. Here is the Japanese original, here is the US version, the European version, the Brazilian version, and finally the Korean version. The main difference is that in true Japanese Mega Drive style, the back of the cover continues the great art, something the Korean version copied as well. I love this image in general, but always preferred the Japanese version for the additional back cover. The Revenge of Shinobi is a great example of the Western art actually beating the Japanese variant all the way around. The US, Brazil, and European versions all had similar art, the hero Joe Musashi against his arch nemesis. I always loved the look of this and was honestly a bit disappointed in the Japanese version. Known as the Super Shinobi there, it chose to use art from the title screen on the front cover, and a simple silhouette of our hero on the back. It isn't bad, but I definitely prefer the Western take here. I was always appreciative of the US cover of Streets of Rage. It was a group of ass-kicking good guys set against a dark cityscape. What more could you want? The European and Brazilian covers followed suit, using a very similar style themselves. The Japanese had a different idea, taking their version called Bare Knuckle and using a style that resembled the in-game assets pretty closely. I really dig this version for that, and love the zoomed out city backdrop. I'll always have nostalgia for the Western design, but the Japanese take wins out here. The US box art for Castlevania Bloodlines is as classic gets when it comes to game art. Our hero is set against a background full of his enemies and the big bad Drac himself. As good as this one is, I also really like the European and Japanese take. They both prominently feature both heroes set against one of the game's main villains. The European art takes directly after the Japanese version, but of course uses Castlevania the New Generation as its name. This is one where I actually needed to own all three, since it's my favorite game on the platform and all. Our last Genesis entry is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Hyperstone Heist. I chose this one because of the variance between the three major regions, all of them quite different from one another. The US and Brazilian releases use a similar style, a great mix of the original comic book influence and in-game story. This is about as perfect as it gets with this universe, and my personal favorite. That doesn't mean that the others weren't great, however. The European cover looks a lot more like the animated cartoon of the 1980s, and the Japanese version does its own thing entirely. I gotta admit, all three have their own appeal, and I'd be happy with any one of them. The box art to most US Saturn games was a major letdown for me. While some were okay, the vast majority really failed to capture the same majesty as their Japanese counterparts. Panzer Dragoon Saga definitely fell into that category. The US and European covers were simply the two main cast members just chillin', portrait style, while an uninterested dragon just looked off into the wild blue yonder. It was basic, and although it stayed true to the art direction of the game, just wasn't that great to me. The Japanese cover, however, was drop dead gorgeous. It was the same two characters displayed on the front, but this time set against other elements from the game. On a side note, I also prefer the Japanese name. Virtua Fighter Remix had an interesting release in the US. The retail long box version was very limited and is quite expensive today. I enjoyed the artwork for it quite a bit though. It's full-on anime inspired and works great. The European retail release went in a completely different direction, looking a lot more like something you'd see for Virtua Fighter 2. The Japanese and Korean versions went with a more hand-drawn, penciled-in look that looks really nice. I always enjoyed the Virtua Fighter collages, and this one looks incredible no matter the region. One of my favorite early games for the Saturn was a stall. The US version got a decent cover for the game, if slightly uninspired. The Japanese edition was more colorful and more faithful to the in-game assets. Perhaps the greatest omission in the US was the fact that Sega completely left off the title on the spine, opting for a plain white strip with absolutely nothing on it. I would love to show you guys a European variant, but Sega didn't even bother releasing this one there. Tectoy did get it out in Brazil at least, using similar art to the US version. Another favorite of mine is Guardian Heroes. The US cover art is just awful, however. It puts you in mind of that awful He-Man reboot in the 1980s, and just doesn't do the game any justice. The Japanese art is definitely better, with a nice collage of the cast that looks much more game accurate. I think I like the European release the best, however. It keeps a similar look to the Japanese art, but the collage is now set against fire, which also extends to the title. Owning any region of this game is awesome, but you PAL guys got the better case in my opinion. Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight was released only in Japan for the Sega Saturn. The beautiful artwork was damn near worth owning the game for, which was a nice spread of the in-game playable cast and the main villain Dracula. While no other region received the Saturn edition, The box art for the PlayStation version was quite a bit simpler. It was just the shadow of a castle with some lightning behind it. This stood in direct contrast to the excellent Japanese art of the PlayStation version, which was different from the Saturn version too. It focused on Alucard with the castle in the backdrop, and is one of the most iconic images from the series. I actually own every release of this title, not just because it's a favorite of mine, but also because it's one that's a hell of a showpiece in the old game room. The final Saturn game is Nights into Dreams. This is yet another one where the US box art just pales next to the offerings elsewhere. While I don't hate the US art, take a look at what Europe got. I mean freaking night and day comparatively. Oddly enough, the Japanese version went really restrained here, putting just an image of knights on the cover and not much else. I guess the version you prefer depends on the type of art that appeals to you. The simple and clean design of the Japanese version definitely has some charm, and I just love that PAL release cover. Not sure the US art appeals to anyone, but it's there if you want it. People collect video games for all sorts of reasons. Some go for favorite games and hardware, while others go for special editions and the more weird and wonderful stuff. I am not ashamed to admit I have a number of games in my collection for no other reason than I really like the cover art, particularly when it comes to Sega systems. Japan and Europe didn't always have the best in this regard, but it had enough to make me take notice numerous times throughout the years. The appeal of art can have a profound effect on the things you enjoy, and that's definitely the case here. A game you love is made all the better when it has a memorable visual element to go along with it. Many of the games I own are there because I really enjoyed playing them years ago, and I have variants of those games because they offer me more of an already good thing. I think that's a really important part of the hobby to some of us, and it makes owning this stuff all the more interesting. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.